Hey guys, tonight, dim the lights a little. Maybe put your phone face down. Get comfortable, because we're going to drift back to the year 1904, to a place where sports science was more of a vibe than a discipline, and common sense had not yet been formally invited to the Olympics. This is the story of the 1904 Olympic Marathon, which somehow became the most chaotic, drug-assisted, poorly planned endurance event in human history, and everyone involved thought they were doing great. So settle in, take a slow breath, because nothing about this is urgent, nothing is exciting in the normal way. It is just a long parade of bad decisions, unfolding very calmly. Now, first, we need to set the scene. The 1904 Olympics were held in St. Louis, Missouri, which was already a bold choice, not because St. Louis is bad, but because it was summer and humid, and air conditioning was still a distant fantasy whispered about by people who did not yet exist. These Olympics were technically part of the World's Fair, meaning they were not the main attraction. They were kind of happening in the corner, like a folding table with pamphlets nobody asks for. Most European athletes did not show up. Travel was expensive, time-consuming, and deeply unpleasant, so the field was mostly Americans, which will matter later, in ways that are awkward. Now let's talk about the marathon itself. The course was about 24.85 miles, not the modern 26.2, because nobody had standardized anything yet. They just sort of eyeballed it and said, yeah, that feels like a marathon. The race took place on August 30th, in the middle of the afternoon, because of course it did. The temperature was around 90 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity, and the roads were not paved. They were dusty country roads, shared with cars and horses and spectators, who kicked up even more dust. So the runners were essentially breathing hot dirt for several hours, which, medically speaking, is not ideal. But wait, it gets better. There were only 2 water stations on the entire course. 2. This was intentional. The organizers believed that limiting water would train the body. They thought hydration was optional, like stretching or happiness. They genuinely believed that drinking water during a marathon was dangerous, that it would weaken the runner or cause cramps or something vague and theoretical. So instead of water, runners were encouraged to just endure. This decision alone should have ended the event, but it didn't. It was just the opening act. Now let's float gently over to another runner, Fred Lors. Fred Lors was an American runner, and by runner, we mean guy who signed up. Early in the race, Fred began to feel terrible, which makes sense. Everyone did. So around mile 9, Fred stopped. He just stopped. He climbed into a car, because one was there, and rode for about 11 miles. Then the car broke down, at which point Fred got out and started running again. When he reached the stadium, he crossed the finish line, smiling, waving, accepting congratulations. He was declared the winner. Alice Roosevelt, daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, even congratulated him personally, which must have felt nice. Then someone mentioned the car. Fred admitted it immediately, because lying was apparently more effort than the marathon. He said he was just joking, a prank, a lighthearted deception at the Olympic Games. He was disqualified, but briefly he was an Olympic champion. Emotionally, if not officially. Now, before we go further, let's talk about the environment again, because it deserves its own moment. The roads were coated in dust so thick that runners coughed up mud. Their throats were raw, their lungs were irritated. Some were temporarily blinded. Cars driving alongside them created clouds that lingered in the air. They swallowed it, absorbed it, became one with it. Several collapsed. One was chased off course by wild dogs. This is not metaphorical. Another runner stopped to eat apples from an orchard, which were rotten. He developed stomach cramps and then took a nap. He did not finish. And then there was Andarin Carvajal. Carvajal was a Cuban mailman, which already makes him one of the most relatable people in this story. He raised money to travel to the Olympics, lost most of it gambling, arrived in St. Louis with almost nothing. He ran the marathon in street clothes, long pants, a button-up shirt, leather shoes. Someone cut his pants into shorts with a knife, which is thoughtful in a chaotic way. During the race, he stopped to talk to spectators because he was friendly and curious. He also stopped at the same orchard as the apple guy, ate some fruit, which also did not go well for him. At one point, he lay down and took a nap, because why not? He eventually finished fourth, which is honestly incredible. Now let's slowly drift back to Thomas Hicks, because while all this chaos was happening, he was still moving. Barely. By mile 20, Hicks was completely exhausted. His skin was gray. His eyes were glassy. He could not stand on his own. His trainers gave him more strychnine and brandy, because at this point the plan was commitment. He began to stagger wildly. He hallucinated that the finish line was far away when it was close, or close when it was far away. He was carried, supported, dragged toward the end. When he crossed the finish line, he collapsed immediately. Doctors worked on him for an hour. He nearly died. But he won, and in 1904, that was the main thing. The official records list Thomas Hicks as the Olympic marathon champion, with an asterisk that history has quietly attached. Because after this event, people began to reconsider some things, like water and poison, and letting cars drive next to runners. But at the time, the organizers saw this as a success. They believed they had proven something about endurance, about toughness, about the human spirit. What they mostly proved was that the early 20th century was deeply unserious about athlete safety. When the 1904 Olympic marathon finally ended, the crowd did not erupt in horror. There was no collective moment of reflection. Nobody stood up and said, "Hey, maybe that was a mistake." Instead, officials nodded, doctors scribbled notes, and everyone involved began explaining, very confidently, why this had all been fine. Because this was an era obsessed with science, but not the careful kind, more like vibes-based science. The kind where you watch a man collapse after ingesting poison and think, interesting data point. The marathon became a case study, not in what not to do, but in what the human body could apparently survive, which is a very different takeaway. One of the loudest voices in this discussion was James Edward Sullivan. Sullivan was the director of the St. Louis Olympics. He was also deeply convinced that he understood athletics better than anyone else alive. Sullivan believed the marathon had proven something about endurance, that they seen runners collapsing and thought, yes, this is the body adapting. He argued that drinking water during long-distance running was dangerous, that it weakened the stomach, that it reduced endurance. He did not waver on this, even when presented with evidence. Because remember, several runners were hospitalized. One nearly died. Multiple collapsed on the course. One was chased by dogs, which does not usually happen in controlled experiments. But Sullivan saw discipline. He saw toughness. He saw masculinity being forged through heat stroke. And this mindset did not vanish overnight. For years afterward, athletes were discouraged from drinking water during races. Coaches repeated the same logic. Dehydration builds character. Water is a crutch. Pain is temporary. Kidney damage is forever, but they did not know that yet. Now let's slowly revisit Thomas Hicks, because his victory was celebrated, and also quietly uncomfortable. Officially, Hicks was a champion. Unofficially, everyone knew he had been chemically assisted. But since there were no doping rules, there was nothing to argue about. In fact, strychnine was considered cutting edge, a performance enhancer, a scientific tool. Doctors of the era believed that small doses stimulated the nervous system, which they do, briefly, before things get complicated. So Hicks became an example, not of excess, but of innovation. Other athletes took note. In the years following, stimulants were common. Brandy, caffeine, ether, cocaine-based tonics, all perfectly respectable. The idea of a clean athlete simply did not exist. The body was a machine, and machines ran better with additives. Now, let's float back to Fred Lors for a moment, because his story didn't end with embarrassment. After being disqualified, Lors claimed it was all a misunderstanding, a joke that got out of hand, a light-hearted prank during the Olympics. And shockingly, he was not banned for life. He was suspended briefly, then allowed to compete again. Later, he won the Boston Marathon legitimately, on foot, the entire way, which is almost annoying because it complicates the narrative. But history is like that, messy, unbothered by clean morals. And then there's Andarin Carvajal, the Cuban mailman, the accidental philosopher of the marathon. Carvajal returned home with no medal, but with stories. He became something of a folk hero, the man who ran an Olympic marathon in street clothes, stopped to chat, ate fruit, took naps, and still finished near the top. In a race dominated by suffering, he somehow looked like he was just wandering through history. Now, while all this was happening, another uncomfortable truth was quietly settling in. The marathon had not been fair. Not because of cheating, but because of who was allowed to compete. Most of the runners were American, because most international athletes simply could not get to St. Louis. Travel was expensive, time-consuming, and not worth it for an event nobody respected yet. So the field was limited, the competition uneven, and the results skewed. Which brings us to a subtle but important undercurrent of the 1904 Games: racial pseudoscience. Sullivan and others believed the marathon could prove theories about racial endurance. They expected certain groups to excel, others to fail. They were wrong, spectacularly. Several runners from marginalized backgrounds performed well. Some Americans did not. The data did not cooperate, so it was quietly ignored. Instead, the focus remained on individual grit, on suffering as proof of superiority, on survival as success. And this philosophy lingered. For decades, endurance sports embraced discomfort as virtue. The worse it felt, the better you were doing. If you collapsed at the finish, that meant you tried hard enough. This is where the marathon's cultural mythology really formed. The idea that it should be miserable, that enjoyment meant weakness, that hydration was suspicious. Modern sports science would spend the next century gently undoing this damage. Now, let's slow down even further, because we're going to step away from the race itself and look at the aftermath in a broader sense. The 1904 Olympics were largely considered a failure. Poor attendance, confusing organization, events stretched out over months. Some athletes didn't even realize they were competing in Olympic events. The marathon, ironically, became one of the most memorable parts, not because it was inspiring, but because it was absurd. Newspapers reported it with a mix of pride and concern. Some praised the toughness, others quietly questioned the planning. But nothing changed immediately. The next Olympics would still struggle, still experiment, still push bodies beyond reason. Because early sports culture was deeply experimental and deeply unconcerned with long-term consequences. Athletes were test subjects, willing or not, and the audience loved it. There was something satisfying about watching people suffer for glory. It felt ancient, heroic, very Greek, even when it was mostly just dehydration. Now, let's drift back to the concept of drugs, because the 1904 marathon is often cited as the first major example of Olympic doping. But nobody thought of it that way at the time. The idea of fair play was still forming. If a substance was available, it was fair. If it helped, it was smart. There was no line yet, no moral boundary, just curiosity. And so athletes experimented on themselves, sometimes with guidance, sometimes with vibes. It wouldn't be until athletes started dying that rules emerged, and even then, slowly. The 1904 marathon sits at the beginning of that timeline, a warning sign nobody read. Now, take a slow breath here, because the next part of this story gets quieter. The runners went home. They healed, or didn't. Life moved on, but the myth remained. The marathon as a test of suffering, as a ritual of endurance, as something you conquer rather than experience. That mythology still exists today, even with water stations every mile, even with electrolyte gels, even with medical tents. People still brag about how little they drank, how much it hurt, how close they came to collapse. And that, in a strange way, is the legacy of 1904. A race that taught everyone the wrong lesson, very thoroughly. By the time the 1904 Olympic marathon faded from newspaper headlines, it didn't disappear. It simply settled, like a strange smell in a room people decided not to talk about. No official inquiry followed, no dramatic reforms were announced. No one stood at a podium and said, "We have learned something important about hydration." Instead, the event was quietly absorbed into the growing mythology of endurance sports. Because if there is one thing humans love, it's turning mistakes into traditions. In the years after 1904, the marathon became sacred, not because of joy, but because of suffering. People talked about it in hushed tones. They repeated the stories, the heat, the dust, the collapse at the finish line. Not as warnings, but as inspiration. And this is where the narrative really hardened. Marathon running was framed as a test of character, a spiritual ordeal, something you endure rather than enjoy. If it felt good, you were doing it wrong. If it hurt, you were becoming something better. This attitude seeped into coaching manuals, into locker rooms, into casual advice exchanged between men who had read exactly one article in 1905 and decided that was enough research for a lifetime. Drink less water, toughen up, ignore the pain. All of this traced back, in part, to that one afternoon in St. Louis. Now let's talk about the record books, because they are very calm about all of this. Thomas Hicks is listed as the winner. Time, 3 hours, 28 minutes, and 53 seconds. That time stood as an Olympic record for years, not because it was impressive, but because nobody wanted to think too hard about how it was achieved. His near-death experience was reframed as heroic perseverance. The poison became a footnote. The fact that he was physically supported became vague. Language softened the reality. This happens a lot in history. If you describe something enough times with the right tone, it becomes respectable. And so Hicks became a symbol, a man who pushed past his limits, not a man who was medically mishandled. Now, while this mythology was forming, sports medicine was still catching up. Early 20th century physiology was confident and wrong, a dangerous combination. Doctors believed fatigue was caused by waste products in the muscles. They thought thirst was psychological. They were wrong on all counts, but confidently so. So when athletes collapsed, it wasn't seen as failure, it was seen as proof of effort. And effort, culturally, mattered more than survival. Now, let's gently zoom out to the Olympics themselves. The 1904 Olympics never really took seriously. They were overshadowed by the World's Fair, scattered across months, poorly attended. Many events had only American competitors, some had only one. Medals were given out almost by default. But the marathon stood out. It felt ancient, epic, even when it was mostly just dehydration and confusion. So it became one of the few moments people remembered. And because memory loves drama, the chaos was preserved. Stories grew taller, details got fuzzier, but the core remained. Men collapsing, men staggering, men proving something vague and manly. This fit perfectly into the early 20th century obsession with toughness. The world was industrializing. Cities were growing. Life felt softer to some people. Endurance sports became a way to reassure themselves that humanity had not become weak. Which is ironic because the suffering was mostly self-inflicted. Now, let's return briefly to Andarin Carvajal because his story aged differently. Over time, he became a symbol of joy, improvisation, humanity. The man who ran without obsession, who talked, who rested, who treated the marathon like a long walk through history. In modern retellings, he's often the most beloved figure. Not because he won, but because he didn't treat the race like a religious trial. He ran because he was there, because he could, because it was happening. There's something quietly comforting about that. Now, as decades passed, rules slowly emerged. Hydration stations became more common. Medical oversight improved. Doping regulations were eventually introduced. But the attitude lingered. Even today, you'll hear runners talk about earning water, about pushing through thirst, about ignoring signals. The ghost of 1904 is still jogging beside them, very slowly, very dehydrated. Now let's talk about memory versus reality. The 1904 Olympic Marathon is often described as the most chaotic race ever, and it probably was. But what's interesting is how calmly it was accepted at the time. Nobody panicked, nobody sued, nobody canceled future races. The bar was simply lower. Risk was normal. Injury was expected. Death was a possibility. Modern audiences look back in horror, but contemporaries mostly shrugged. This wasn't negligence, it was optimism. They genuinely believed they were doing something noble, and that belief carried them forward. Now, take a slow pause here, because we're nearing the end of the story. The 1904 Olympic Marathon did not directly change everything. It did not spark immediate reform. It did not revolutionize sports science overnight. What it did was linger, as a cautionary tale nobody framed as one, as a legend that taught the wrong lessons. It became part of the foundation. And foundations are hard to question once they're buried under tradition. So when you watch a modern marathon, with water every mile, with medical tents, with volunteers and safety protocols, you are watching the long correction of a single afternoon in St. Louis. An afternoon where men ran through dust, avoided water, ingested poison, and called it progress. And that, quietly, is the legacy. No explosions, no villains, just confidence, ignorance, and a very hot day.
So here we are, the final stretch. Not in a heroic way, just calmly approaching the end, like everyone probably should have done in 1904. By the time historians really began looking back at the St. Louis Marathon, the world had changed. Medicine improved. Sports science became a real thing. People started measuring stuff instead of guessing. And slowly, very slowly, the 1904 marathon stopped being a blueprint and started becoming a warning. But that took time. For decades, it lived in an awkward middle space, too embarrassing to celebrate properly, too dramatic to ignore. When later Olympic committees reviewed early games, St. Louis was treated like a rough draft, something experimental, something we don't really do anymore. And yet, the marathon survived. Not just survived, it thrived. Because despite everything, people liked the idea of it. The long distance, the endurance, the symbolism of pushing forward even when it's uncomfortable. They just quietly removed the poison and added water. By the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, hydration was still controversial but less restricted. By the 1920s, it was normal. By the mid-20th century, it was encouraged. not because of a single revelation, but because enough runners collapsed in enough places that ignoring it became inconvenient. The science finally caught up with reality. Dehydration didn't make you stronger, it made you worse, sometimes permanently. Stimulants didn't unlock hidden reserves, they masked warning signs. Pain was not a badge of honor, it was information. All things Thomas Hicks' body had tried to communicate very clearly. Now, about Hicks himself. After the marathon, he recovered, slowly. He lived for many years afterward. He never competed at that level again, which is understandable. His Olympic victory remained official, but it was rarely celebrated with enthusiasm. There are no statues, no dramatic paintings, no inspirational quotes carved into stone. His legacy is mostly academic, a footnote, a lesson. Fred Lohr's faded into relative obscurity, remembered mostly for the car ride, which is fair. Andorine Carvajal became the quiet favorite of modern retellings, the man who didn't take the whole thing seriously and somehow ended up looking the wisest. Now let's talk about why the 1904 marathon still gets mentioned so often. It's not just because it was chaotic. Sports history is full of chaos. It's because it exposes something very human, the desire to test limits without understanding them, the confidence to push forward without preparation, the belief that suffering automatically equals meaning. That mindset wasn't unique to sports. It was everywhere in the early 20th century. Factories, armies, exploration. People were obsessed with endurance, with proving toughness, with surviving conditions instead of improving them. The marathon fit perfectly into that worldview, and that's why the event didn't immediately feel wrong. It felt honest to them. Now, from a modern perspective, it feels absurd. 2 water stations, poison as medicine, cars pacing runners on dusty roads. But absurdity is just outdated normal. And someday, parts of modern sports will look just as strange. The energy gels, the carbon-plated shoes, the obsession with marginal gains. Future historians will shake their heads, calmly, and write long monologues about it. Now, one last thing worth mentioning. The 1904 Olympic marathon didn't kill the spirit of endurance sports. It refined it. It forced the conversation, even if slowly, even if indirectly, by showing what happens when preparation is replaced with ideology, when belief overrides evidence. It taught organizers eventually that athletes are not symbols, they are bodies, fragile ones. The race also quietly reshaped the idea of fairness. No more cars, clearer rules, standard distances. The modern marathon exists because the early ones were so badly handled. In that sense, the chaos had value, unintentionally, and that's usually how progress works, not through brilliance, but through enough mistakes that repetition becomes embarrassing. So, when people call the 1904 Olympic marathon the most chaotic race in history, they're not wrong, but it wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. It was confusion, confidence, and a deep misunderstanding of biology, wrapped in optimism. The runners didn't know they were part of history. They thought they were just running. The organizers didn't think they were negligent. They thought they were bold. And the audience didn't see tragedy. They saw spectacle. All of them were a little wrong. And that's why this story still gets told. Not loudly, not dramatically, but slowly, calmly, as a reminder that progress is often just the long process of realizing we were very sure about very incorrect things. And that, quietly, is where this story ends.
Let's float gently into the murky, foggy, and increasingly rank streets of London in 1858. London was already the sort of city that could make you rethink life choices if you were walking around in summer. Crowded streets, horse-drawn carriages leaving their gifts on every corner, smoke curling from chimneys like a black smudge across the skyline. But the summer of 1858 was different. Something had shifted. Something was brewing in the rivers and sewers beneath the city. Something that frankly smelled awful.
You see, the Thames, which runs lazily through London, had long been used as a convenient dumping ground. Industrial waste, sewage, kitchen leftovers, a stray cow carcass from time to time, it all ended up in the water. And by convenient, I mean people basically treated the river as if it were an extra-large trash bin, because why not? Why separate waste when you have a river that flows? This had been going on for decades. Politicians and city planners had mostly ignored it. Some scientists complained about cholera outbreaks, but people just sort of shrugged and said, well, Londoners are tough, they'll survive. And they did, sort of, though not without occasional grim incidents involving cholera and typhoid. But then, in the summer of 1858, the city hit a breaking point. The heat that year was merciless. The sun baked the city. Roads turned into dust, and the river, well, it didn't improve. It festered. The sewage and industrial runoff fermented in the sun, and by July, the smell was described in newspapers as, quote, a pestilent effluvia, intolerable and almost unbelievable to those who have not witnessed it. Or, in simpler terms, London smelled like a combination of rotten eggs, decaying vegetables, and despair. Parliament sat right on the Thames embankment, which in theory should have been an inspiring location. Gothic architecture, river views, maybe a little swan gliding by. But in practice, they were gagging. Members of Parliament reportedly had to drape towels over their noses during sessions, and some were so affected that they abandoned their duties entirely. Imagine debating fiscal policy while your face is assaulted by what can only be described as the smell of the apocalypse. This event naturally earned the charming name, the Great Stink. And it wasn't just a passing inconvenience, it forced action, because even Victorian stubbornness has limits. London's politicians could ignore cholera and disease, they could ignore public complaints, but they could not ignore the smell. The stench had reached a level that was physically impossible to endure indoors, in the halls of government where manners usually prevailed above all else. Now, the man responsible for fixing it, or at least attempting to, was a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. He had the kind of last name that sounds fancy enough to be ignored in polite conversation, but practical enough to be taken seriously when talking about sewers. Bazalgette was tasked with designing a comprehensive sewer system for London, something no one had managed to do properly until then. His solution was massive, like actually massive, miles of tunnels beneath the city, built with the precision of a Swiss watch and the determination of a man who had clearly smelled too many Thames fumes in his lifetime. Bazalgette's plan diverted the sewage downstream, out of central London, into treatment works far away from populated areas, and it worked. Not immediately, because construction took years, but eventually London would stop smelling like a river of decay. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before Bazalgette's tunnels started turning the tide, the summer of 1858 remained hellishly pungent. People reportedly wore masks not for style, but for survival. Boats on the Thames carried the faint but ever-present odor of rot, drifting into nearby streets. Even the air coming through windows was tainted. It's said that some Londoners actually fled the city for a few weeks, retreating to the countryside in search of fresh air, or at least air that didn't make them want to cry quietly in despair. And here's a fun little detail. The stench didn't just affect humans. Dogs reportedly refused to swim in the river. Fish floated belly up along the banks. Swans and ducks gave Londoners the cold shoulder, or the equivalent in bird terms. Even the wildlife was saying, nope, not today. So why is this story oddly relaxing to think about at bedtime? Well, there's something almost meditative about imagining the persistence of Londoners. They endured, they suffered, they complained with gentle, ironic despair. And then, quietly, engineers went to work,
Tunnels were dug, pipes laid, and the river eventually became manageable. The stench faded. The city carried on. History, in a sense, always continues, even when it smells awful. All right, I think we can let this part of the story drift gently into the background. Imagine Londoners of the 1850s fanning themselves in their parlors, holding handkerchiefs to their noses, dreaming of clean rivers that may or may not exist somewhere beyond the city limits. It's quiet, it's monotonous, it's perfect for relaxing your mind as we float toward the next part of this tale, where we'll look at more eccentric responses, smaller disasters, and personal anecdotes of people living in the stinky city. All right, so we've established that London in the summer of 1858 was basically a giant, boiling, living trash heap with a river running through it. But what was it actually like for the people who lived there? Let's float down into the streets a little and imagine a day, or several, of existence in this olfactory nightmare. First, let's consider the average Londoner.
And by average, I mean the sort of person who's not a politician, not an engineer, not Queen Victoria, just someone trying to get by without collapsing in a puddle of despair. They woke up in the morning, opened their windows, and were immediately greeted by the subtle fragrance of, well, everything wrong with the city at once. Breakfast might have smelled decent if you were lucky, toast, porridge, tea, but quickly overpowered by the drifting aroma from the Thames. Rats were another part of the ambiance. Now, London always had rats, always. They were like unofficial city council members, present, opinionated, and impossible to ignore. But during the Great Stink, the rats were particularly bold. With all that sewage on the streets and floating in the river, the rodents were practically pampered. People reported seeing them scuttling along embankments, seemingly chuckling at human discomfort. And some enterprising Londoners, because of course someone would do this, actually tried to sell rat-catching services door to door. Yes, the Great Stink created temporary entrepreneurial opportunities. Now, not everyone was panicking, of course. Some people, typically the very rich, decided that what the city really needed was, well, denial. If they couldn't smell it directly, maybe it didn't exist. They closed their windows, burned some incense, and carried on as if the stench were a mild inconvenience. Of course, servants and tradespeople, who could not simply retreat to the countryside, had a slightly different experience. Imagine walking along streets where the air is essentially a permanent layer of rot. These folks had to breathe it all day, every day, probably inventing silent curses to mutter under their breath at the Thames. Parliament, as we already mentioned, was a very dramatic observer of all this. Some members claimed the stench gave them headaches. Others confessed that they couldn't work, couldn't read documents, couldn't possibly debate taxes or foreign policy while smelling, literally, the smell of the apocalypse. The newspapers had a field day reporting on this, of course, and described MPs waving handkerchiefs and fans at their faces. One newspaper even suggested Parliament might be forced to relocate because clearly moving the building is easier than dealing with the actual problem. And then there was Joseph Bazalgette, the engineer, calmly planning underground tunnels while the entire city gagged above. He probably woke up, brewed a cup of tea, sniffed the air, and thought, "Yep, this will need some serious piping." And unlike many Victorian bureaucrats, Bazalgette did not waste time complaining. He drew plans, lobbied for funding, and eventually started digging the most ambitious sewer system the city had ever seen. But we'll get back to him later, because first we need to linger on the human side of the Great Stink. Let's talk about houses. Victorian London homes often had their bathrooms, or privies, opening directly onto the street, which was charming in a grotesque sort of way. So when the Thames started backing up and the sewers couldn't handle the load, it was not uncommon for people to find, well, unwelcome souvenirs of the city's digestive habits appearing near their doorsteps. Imagine stepping outside to fetch your morning paper and finding a floating, unidentifiable blob drifting lazily past. It was all part of life. They called it civilization. And the social response was fascinatingly human. Some people started wearing masks, not for fashion, not as a statement, but genuinely because their noses hurt. They tried holding wet handkerchiefs to their faces or spritzing vinegar around the room. One enterprising gentleman reportedly suggested carrying around a small bucket of charcoal, which when burned could purify the air. People tried it. It didn't help much, but they did feel fancy while they failed. Meanwhile, small businesses suffered quietly. Shops that relied on foot traffic had fewer customers because walking along streets smelling like decayed onions and human waste is a deterrent even in 19th century London. Bakers noticed bread went unsold. Tailors had fewer clients trying on clothes in stuffy, stinky fitting rooms. And pubs, well, people still went to pubs, but mostly to escape the smell at home. It was a strange, upside-down world where the pub became the olfactory refuge. Even the literature of the time hints at this general malaise. Newspapers, diaries, and letters from Londoners all describe the summer as oppressive, slow, and unpleasant, but always there's a tinge of dry humor, because what else can you do when the river itself conspires against you? One commentator mused that London was not a city, but a great perfume experiment gone very wrong, which is about as polite a way you could describe it. Now, in terms of health, the Great Stink was a subtle villain. Cholera had been haunting the city in waves for decades, long before 1858, and the Thames had played a starring role. People knew that drinking or bathing in the river could be dangerous, but hygiene was complicated back then. Soap existed, but the smell was sometimes stronger than the odor it was meant to counter. Children played in the streets unaware of invisible dangers, while adults sighed heavily and contemplated the inevitability of fate. Let's float over to some personal anecdotes that really capture the spirit of this summer. One man, a minor civil servant, reportedly wrote in his diary that he spent 3 hours traveling from Westminster to his office, covering his nose with a moistened handkerchief that was less effective than he hoped. Upon arrival, he immediately fainted from the sheer assault of scent indoors. His colleague reportedly remarked, "At least he did not suffer alone." A young woman visiting London from the countryside described the city in letters home as a place where even the flowers smell suspicious. She compared the air to a soup of decay, which, though slightly poetic, is not inaccurate. Eventually, she fled to a relative's estate north of the city, where the air smelled of grass, occasionally damp soil, and most importantly, not despair. And of course, some people tried to profit off the stench. Vendors selling perfume and aromatic oils reported a sudden spike in sales. Handkerchief makers had a minor renaissance. Even vinegar, lemon juice, and scented sachets became oddly fashionable. There's something quietly amusing in imagining upper-class Londoners waving little bottles under their noses while the river, unapologetic, continued to produce its signature bouquet. All of this brings us back to the slow, inevitable march of engineering. While citizens suffered, Bazalgette's plans were moving forward. Tunnels were dug, sewers constructed, and slowly the stench began to recede, over years, not days. It was a long, drawn-out process, which somehow fits perfectly with the lethargic, sleepy vibe of the Victorian summer. The river would not be purified overnight. Life moved on in fits and starts. People complained, children played, rats thrived, and the city endured. So, as we drift to the end of this segment, picture Londoners, faces half covered, eyes squinting against the sun, fans in one hand, damp handkerchief in the other, moving slowly through streets that smell like human error. There's a quiet rhythm to it, a slow, steady, unavoidable march toward, eventually, something slightly less terrible. It's a perfect illustration of the patience, absurdity, and understated humor that life in Victorian London required.
All right, so we've established that London in 1858 was essentially a fragrant apocalypse. Rats were thriving, people were fanning themselves with handkerchiefs, and politicians were seriously considering relocating Parliament. But now we need to focus on the quiet hero of this story, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, civil engineer extraordinaire. Bazalgette was, by all accounts, the sort of man who didn't complain much. He had already been working for the Metropolitan Board of Works for years, handling smaller sewer projects around the city, but nothing on this scale. The Great Stink, however, was exactly the kind of large, unavoidable problem he excelled at. And honestly, it was probably the first time the stench directly affected Parliament, so the political will to fund him was unusually generous. The plan was deceptively simple in theory. Dig enormous tunnels under London, collect all the sewage, and divert it downstream, away from the city. In practice, of course, it was colossal. Bazalgette's tunnels were huge, lined with brick, stretching for miles under the city streets. It was a project that required thousands of workers, enormous amounts of materials, and a patience level that would make a monk look hyperactive. And Bazalgette had a secret advantage: foresight. He deliberately overbuilt the system. Most engineers would have designed it for immediate needs, maybe adding a foot or two of extra capacity. Not Bazalgette. He calculated the population growth of London decades into the future and doubled the size of the pipes. Which is why, today, long after the Victorian stench has faded into history, his sewers still work. It's a quiet reminder that planning ahead can occasionally save the day and the nose. Construction wasn't glamorous, of course. Thousands of laborers, many of whom were poor and had limited protections, dug tunnels in difficult conditions. They worked in dark, damp spaces, sometimes ankle-deep in sewage before the system was complete. There were complaints, naturally. Workers grumbled about conditions, supervisors grumbled about workers, and politicians grumbled about spending. But the work went on, slowly, methodically, quietly heroic in a very stinky sort of way. The Great Stink also revealed something funny about Victorian politics. Parliament had been remarkably ineffective at addressing public health crises for decades. Cholera outbreaks, typhoid, general urban squalor, it all happened. People died, and funding requests were ignored. But when the stench became physically unbearable, suddenly Parliament sprang into action. Handkerchiefs over noses, fans flapping dramatically, fainting members, and still some of them argued about budget details while trying not to gag. The stench, in effect, forced politicians to do their jobs. Meanwhile, Londoners carried on with daily life. Imagine crossing Westminster Bridge, the river below bubbling with industrial waste, the air heavy with rot, and seeing a city that refused to pause for olfactory tragedy. Shopkeepers wiped counters, children played in the streets, and the very determined vendors of perfumes and oils hawked their wares to anyone who could still smell. And all the while, Bazalgette's vision slowly took shape beneath the city, invisible but immensely effective. It's also worth noting the ironic side of this project. In many ways, the Great Stink was a triumph of bureaucracy. Centuries of ignoring sanitation had left London in a nearly hopeless situation, but eventually, careful planning, precise engineering, and a stubborn insistence on logic overcame sheer human neglect. And Bazalgette, quietly brilliant, became an unsung hero. Most Londoners probably didn't know his name. Rats certainly didn't care, but the sewers were laid, the river stopped being a literal hazard, and Parliament could resume debating matters that, theoretically, mattered more than odor. The human reactions during this period were delightfully varied. Some writers, as we mentioned, documented the stench with dry humor. One columnist suggested that the Thames might be better used as a giant compost heap than as a river,
and another speculated that the stench was a natural method of population control, something that historians would probably not include in textbooks, which makes for a quietly amusing bedtime thought. Even in literature, references to the Great Stink popped up. Novels of the era sometimes casually mentioned the oppressive air, the persistent odors, or the absurdity of city life when your morning walk feels like inhaling a rotten soup. And it wasn't just the smell itself, it was the way it permeated every aspect of life: politics, health, social interactions, commerce. London became a city defined, however briefly, by its ability to endure the unbearable. And here's a personal touch. A few diarists wrote about evenings spent trying to sleep while the smell drifted in through slightly open windows. They described dreams that smelled faintly of sewage, vague anxieties about rivers, and waking up with a handkerchief clutched to the face. There's a quiet, almost poetic horror to this, not dramatic, not shocking, just persistent, banal, and deeply immersive. Perfect, if you think about it, for drifting off to sleep while listening to a long history monologue. Of course, we can't forget the minor absurdities. Some upper-class households, desperate to escape the odor, installed fans and ventilation systems that were, at best, slightly effective. Others tried burning aromatic woods and oils, creating indoor fogs that mixed with the stench outside to form a very confusing olfactory experience. And in true Victorian fashion, some citizens blamed the government, some blamed industrialists, some blamed the river itself, and some quietly blamed their neighbors for living nearby. By the end of the summer, though, change was inevitable. Funding for Bazalgette's plan was approved, and construction continued apace. The Thames would eventually recover.
Smells would diminish. Londoners, ever patient, would continue their lives. But for a few weeks, the city had been defined by the olfactory equivalent of a slow, stubborn drumbeat. The Great Stink became a sort of quiet legend, mentioned occasionally in memoirs, discussed by students of civil engineering, and remembered fondly by historians with a taste for slightly absurd catastrophes. So as we float toward the end of this section, picture the scene. London in the heat of summer. Buildings shimmering in the haze, bridges crowded with people fanning themselves, parliamentarians fainting in ornate chambers, and a civil engineer quietly drawing plans underground, oblivious to the chaos above. The smell is everywhere, impossible to escape, yet life moves on. And eventually, slowly, inexorably, order emerges from olfactory chaos. So by late 1858, after weeks of persistent olfactory assault, Parliament had finally committed to Bazalgette's plan in full. Funding was approved, contracts signed, and thousands of workers continued to dig, brick by brick, tunnel by tunnel, beneath the city. The Great Stink hadn't disappeared overnight. Progress in London rarely does. But the city had at least agreed that the smell needed to go away permanently. Construction on Bazalgette's sewer system was a slow, meticulous process. Tunnels were dug deep enough to stay well below the streets, lined with millions of hand-laid bricks, and reinforced to last generations. It wasn't glamorous work. There were no celebratory ceremonies, no newspaper headlines shouted, "Sewers of London complete," because by the time they were done, the public had mostly forgotten just how bad it had been. But the city's engineers knew, quietly, that they had accomplished something monumental. One interesting detail is that Bazalgette's foresight continued to pay off long after his death. He had calculated the population growth of London decades into the future and built the sewers with extra capacity. This meant that as the city expanded, more people, more waste, more industrial runoff, the system still worked. In essence, one man's careful math saved countless noses for generations, a quietly heroic act with little fanfare.
Meanwhile, life above ground gradually normalized. The Thames, once a thick, black, floating soup of waste, began to clear. Fish returned, the occasional swan paddled by, and the scent of rot became an unpleasant memory rather than a daily reality. Shops reopened fully, children could play near the river without fainting, and politicians could breathe indoor air without handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The stench that had forced action had, over time, vanished, leaving behind a more functional, less dramatic city. It's important to note that the Great Stink didn't just lead to cleaner water. It sparked a broader awareness of public health, urban planning, and sanitation. Citizens and city planners began to consider things they had long ignored: drainage, waste management, clean water supply, and the invisible but very real effects of disease. The event, unpleasant as it was, became a catalyst for modern urban infrastructure. London would never again treat its river like a personal trash bin, at least not without serious consequences. There were, of course, lingering cultural quirks. Writers, diarists, and journalists continued to reference the Great Stink with subtle humor. It became shorthand for any bureaucratic or civic failure that produced highly noticeable, slightly unpleasant results. It's a bit like the Great Stink, people would say, meaning something unavoidable, unignorable, and mildly disgusting. Even decades later, children in Victorian schools might hear about the stench and imagine rivers of rot winding through the streets of London, a cautionary tale wrapped in mild amusement. Some Victorian humor about the Great Stink was almost deadpan. One pamphlet joked that if the city ever needed to repel invaders, it need only leave the Thames as it was in 1858. Quote, "Who would cross such a river willingly?" it asked, quietly, sarcastically, as if the answer were obvious. And indeed, the story of the Great Stink became a gently ironic lesson in cause and effect. Ignore a problem long enough, and it will eventually make everyone pay attention. Londoners adapted in other ways too. Perfume shops thrived for a few years after, perhaps hoping to maintain an air of precaution. Handkerchiefs became accessories in upper-class circles, partly practical, partly performative. Children who had grown up during the stench remembered it as an odd, slightly funny part of their childhood. Rats continued to thrive, because of course they always do, but humans, at least, were better equipped to handle their surroundings. The long-term effect was profound yet subtle. The Thames became a river that could support life. Public health slowly improved. Cholera outbreaks diminished as clean water and proper drainage became priorities. And the city learned, in a quiet, monotone way, that infrastructure matters. Not flashy monuments, not grand speeches, not ornate bridges alone, but practical, invisible systems that keep a city functioning. And while Bazalgette remained largely unsung for his lifetime, the sewers themselves became a silent legacy, carrying away not just waste, but also the collective memory of a city that once smelled so bad that even politicians couldn't ignore it. Londoners moved on, the streets cleaned up, children played near the river again, now with less risk of fainting, and the Thames, once an emblem of neglect, became a symbol of careful planning, slow improvement, and the quiet, patient triumph of engineering over human error. The Great Stink, as an event, remains oddly charming in retrospect. It wasn't exciting. There were no battles, no fires, no dramatic chases, just a city slowly suffocating in its own waste, a few thousand people working tirelessly underground, and a lot of politely fainting politicians above. It's a story that glides gently through history, demonstrating human resilience, the slow impact of civic action, and the subtle humor of a problem so pervasive that it couldn't be ignored. By the 1870s, the new sewer system was complete. London's population had increased, industry had grown, and yet the stench no longer dominated the city. The air became breathable, the river navigable, and public health gradually improved. Bazalgette's tunnels continued to work, largely unnoticed, a testament to careful planning and determination. And in a sense, the Great Stink faded from immediate memory, surviving mostly in diaries, newspapers, and the occasional historical lecture or bedtime story like this one. It is a story that lingers quietly in history, not as drama, not as spectacle, but as a gently ironic reminder of human fallibility, patience, and the eventual triumph of slow, steady solutions. A city once dominated by smell learned the value of planning, infrastructure, and most importantly, the consequences of ignoring problems until they could no longer be ignored. And so London moved forward. The Thames flowed a little cleaner, the streets were a little safer, and the city retained its peculiar Victorian charm, fog, bustle, and occasionally faint memories of a summer when the river itself had protested in the only way it knew how.
Imagine, if you will, the year is somewhere in the 1700s. Europe is expanding, the British Empire is puffing itself up, and prison space on land is getting scarce. So, of course, someone looked at the thousands of old naval ships cluttering the harbors and said, hey, why don't we just put prisoners on those? Because why not double down on misery, right? These hulks, or old ships no longer seaworthy, were stripped down, anchored in rivers or harbors, and converted into prisons. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ships as prisons. That sounds kind of romantic. And maybe, if you squint at them through foggy mist and candlelight, with a soft chill in the air, there is a weird sort of melancholy beauty. But in reality, these were slow, damp, stinking rectangles of human discomfort. Imagine being stuck on a boat that isn't going anywhere, surrounded by other humans who have also somehow ended up in this floating purgatory. The wood rots, the paint peels, the smell, well, let's not dwell too much. But it was bad, very bad, and that's putting it politely. These hulks first became popular in Britain in the early 18th century when land prisons couldn't keep up with rising numbers of convicts. Crime rates weren't exactly tiny. Petty theft, smuggling, desertion from the Navy, all sorts of things got you tossed into one of these ships. And let's remember, transportation to colonies was expensive and slow, so if the government didn't have the resources to ship you off to Australia or America, they'd stick you in a hulk. It was basically a holding pattern, a watery holding cell, if you will. The ships themselves were usually decommissioned warships, old frigates, sloops, maybe a few massive ships of the line that had outlived their usefulness. Their sails and rigging were taken down, sometimes the upper decks removed, and then they were anchored permanently. Prisoners were crammed into the lower decks where air barely reached, and the smell of mold, stagnant water, and human bodies became a permanent fixture. Sleep was often difficult, not just because of discomfort, but because rats, oh yes, the rats, shared every inch of that space with the convicts. And the rats were thorough. They got into everything: food, bedding, clothes, you name it. Life aboard a hulk wasn't just physically uncomfortable, it was monotonous, slow, and endlessly dreary. Prisoners often had no work to do, no exercise, no change of scenery. Some reports suggest guards handed out tasks like patching sails or cleaning the decks, but these were mostly token activities. Mostly people just sat, and they thought, a lot, which is excellent for insomnia, less excellent for sanity. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the irony. Ships had been designed for speed, for adventure, for exploring the world, and here they were, stuck in one spot, slowly rotting, carrying people who weren't going anywhere either. A metaphor for life, perhaps, but also just, a really unpleasant place to be. Prisoners often included women as well, although they were kept in separate hulks when possible. And of course, the conditions didn't improve much with gender segregation. Women endured the same overcrowding, the same vermin, the same damp chill that seemed to seep into every bone. Sometimes families were torn apart, with husbands on one hulk and wives on another.
Occasionally, children were born on board, growing up entirely within the suffocating wooden walls of a moored vessel. And in a world without much medical knowledge, disease spread quickly. Scurvy, dysentery, smallpox. The hulk wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The guards and administrators, for their part, had mixed attitudes. Some were cruel, some indifferent, and some maybe just exhausted. Maintaining a floating prison was not easy. The wood had to be treated, the hull inspected, leaks patched, provisions delivered, and all the while they had hundreds of people living in extremely close quarters, which is not ideal if anyone enjoys order. Riots and rebellions were rare, but mispers and minor altercations were constant. One can only imagine the quiet, resentful plotting, the endless staring at murky river waters, the slow ticking of time that never ended. And of course, food. Let's talk about the food for a moment. Not great. Mostly watery soups, hard biscuits, and whatever meat could be preserved long enough to be shipped in. If it wasn't rotten or infested with bugs, it was bland. Some reports mention that prisoners would fight over the smallest scraps or trade morsels with guards for favors. The slow decay of the ship seemed to mirror the slow decay of morale. Hulk ships weren't just a British phenomenon. Other European powers tried similar strategies, although Britain was the most famous for it, largely because of the sheer number of vessels and prisoners involved. Some were even used to house prisoners of war. Imagine being captured, already tired of fighting, and then sent to a stationary wooden coffin floating in a harbor, surrounded by strangers and disease. It's like the universe's least fun cruise vacation. Interestingly, these hulks had a bit of a cultural afterlife. Artists and writers occasionally noted them in their works, usually as eerie, almost ghostly presences in otherwise bustling harbors. They crept into paintings of naval docks, appearing in the background like rotting monuments to bureaucracy and neglect. There was a certain grim poetry in the way they leaned on the water, half submerged, slowly deteriorating, silently holding thousands of human stories. By the mid-19th century, the practice of using hulk ships began to decline. Land-based prisons had expanded, reform movements started advocating for better conditions, and transportation to colonies became more organized. Ships were eventually broken up, sold, or converted for other uses. Some were burned to recover metal fittings. And yet, for a century or so, hulk ships were a fixture of British naval and penal culture, a quiet, depressing reminder that humans can be creative in uncomfortable ways. So, the next time you see an old ship in a harbor, rocking gently in the water, think of the hulks. Not the Marvel kind, though. That's fun, too. These were hulks that smelled of mildew, despair, and unwashed humanity. Places where time dragged, rats ruled, and every day felt like the slowest day imaginable. And somehow, people survived, or at least endured, clinging to whatever small comforts they could find. A scrap of bread, a patch of sunlight through a porthole, a quiet conversation with a neighbor who was just as miserable.
And that, in a way, is what makes hulks so haunting. Not ghost stories or battles, just the slow, quiet endurance of people living in one of history's most monotonous prisons. The kind of endurance that is almost meditative if you squint at it right, and certainly perfect for a sleepy night of history storytelling. All right, we've floated gently over the main life of hulk ships. From here, let's drift even further into the weird side of penal history. We can talk about some of the more unusual incidents, the people who ended up there, and just how bizarrely inventive the British Empire could be when it came to solving prisoner overflow. If you've got your blanket still wrapped around you, and maybe a soft drink at your side, let's drift gently deeper into the world of hulk ships. Last time, we laid out the broad strokes, old, rotting vessels anchored forever, filled with people who had, shall we say, inconveniently offended the law. Tonight, we'll float among the wooden decks, the damp corridors, and the slow, monotonous rhythms of life aboard these floating prisons. One thing to understand about life on a hulk is that monotony was basically everything.
There was no entertainment, unless you counted arguing over stale bread as entertainment, which, if you do, you'd fit right in. Prisoners would spend their days pacing, sitting, staring out at the water, or occasionally whispering conspiracies about when they might be transferred or escape, though that was mostly wishful thinking. Remember, these ships were anchored in harbors, often surrounded by patrolling guards. You weren't going anywhere. And yet, somehow, the human mind still found ways to fill the endless hours. Some of the most fascinating stories come from the prisoners themselves. Records are often sparse, because who really wanted to write long diaries on a smelly, infested boat? But enough survived to paint a picture. Take, for instance, a sailor named Thomas King, who somehow managed to end up on a hulk for being insolent to a superior officer. He wasn't violent, he didn't steal, he just argued. Thomas, like many others, would spend entire days carving little wooden trinkets using shards of wood from the ship's decaying beams. Eventually, he made a small fleet of tiny ships, which he would float in puddles on the deck. The guards tolerated it, probably because it kept him busy, and in a way, it was one of the few forms of entertainment available. A miniature rebellion of imagination afloat in the stagnant reality of a hulk. Then there were the women prisoners. One example comes from a hulk called the Justitia, moored in the Thames. Among the women was a shoplifter named Mary Fenton, who had a knack for trading small favors for scraps of food or clean water. She was known for knitting tiny dolls out of rags, which she would sell to other prisoners for extra rations. This was, of course, entirely unofficial, but it gave her a small sense of control in a place where control was almost impossible to come by. And for the others, it was a distraction. Small things, dolls, carved boats, whispered gossip, became lifelines to sanity. We also know that life on a hulk could be surprisingly social. That is, if you call shouting at each other across the deck social. Prisoners formed alliances, friendships, and sometimes grudging romances. This wasn't exactly ideal, but human beings are adaptable. There are records of couples meeting aboard hulks, marrying with permission of the authorities, and even having children while still living on the ship. One can only imagine how strange family life must have felt, the child's first steps taken on damp wooden boards under the watchful eye of board guards with the smell of mildew as a constant companion. Disease was, unfortunately, another constant companion. Scurvy, dysentery, smallpox, these weren't occasional inconveniences, they were almost inevitable. The cramped quarters, poor ventilation, and limited hygiene made disease spread like wildfire. Some hulks were quarantined for weeks at a time, not because the authorities were particularly careful, but because once one person got sick, it was just easier to stop everyone from leaving. Doctors were sometimes assigned to check on the prisoners, but the medical knowledge of the time was limited. Treatments were crude, bleeding, herbal concoctions, or just letting nature take its course. And so people endured, or didn't. Food, as I mentioned before, was mostly bad. One surviving logbook describes a typical week on the hulk: a thin broth in the morning, a small portion of salted meat at midday, and hard biscuit in the evening. Fresh water was limited and often contaminated. Rats were not just co-inhabitants, they were competitors. There are anecdotes of prisoners negotiating with each other over scraps, sometimes sacrificing part of their meager rations to avoid fights, other times defending every last morsel with surprising intensity. The psychology of hunger in such an enclosed, monotonous environment is, well, fascinating if you like thinking about slow, grinding misery. Hulks also inspired a strange sort of hierarchy among prisoners. Even in captivity, humans like to organize themselves. Some prisoners became unofficial leaders, mediating disputes or controlling access to small luxuries like slightly cleaner sleeping areas or a better position near the windows where sunlight occasionally reached the lower decks. Others became loners, retreating into corners and muttering to themselves. The guards generally didn't interfere unless things got too noisy or threatening. In some ways, this created a microcosm of society floating in decay, where status, resourcefulness, and even sheer patience determined who fared slightly better. Occasionally, extraordinary incidents occurred. There's one story of a hulk where a group of prisoners secretly brewed their own alcohol using leftover foodstuffs. The concoction was terrible, think vinegar with a hint of mold, but it gave them a temporary escape from monotony.
It wasn't tolerated for long, and when discovered, the culprits were confined to even smaller, more unpleasant quarters. But for a few days, they had a little bit of joy. Tiny sparks like this were rare, but they existed, showing that even in a place as dreary as a hulk, human creativity and stubbornness could survive. Interestingly, guards sometimes had unusual relationships with prisoners. Some were indifferent, some enjoyed the quiet chaos, and some, surprisingly, were sympathetic. One guard is remembered for smuggling small treats to a particularly sickly prisoner, saving him from what would otherwise have been an extremely slow and miserable decline. These moments were exceptions, of course, and mostly anecdotal, but they remind us that even in the worst systems, human kindness can flicker quietly, unnoticed by the larger machinery of bureaucracy. Life on hulks could also inspire subtle humor. Prisoners often developed elaborate nicknames for the ship, for each other, and even for the guards. One hulk, for example, was mockingly called the Floating Palace, though no one believed it. Guards became deck lords, rats became lords of the lower hold, and the smell was politely referred to as the ambient fragrance of the vessel. These small jokes, whispered quietly at night, provided mental relief and a reminder that people were still alive, still thinking, still capable of a small laugh. There are records of a few hulks being used to house particularly notorious or high-profile prisoners. Some of these individuals were treated slightly better, mostly because they were celebrities of crime or war, or because their imprisonment drew public attention. But even then, slightly better meant a bit more space, maybe a slightly less rat-infested corner. The essential monotony remained, and any notions of luxury were almost laughable. And of course, hulks became part of the cultural imagination. Artists painted them as dark, almost ghostly figures floating in otherwise busy ports. Writers mentioned them as symbols of bureaucratic inefficiency, of human endurance, of quiet suffering. They were, in a sense, historical stage props for the slow drama of human life, where time passed differently, more sluggishly, more deliberately than in the bustling world beyond the harbor walls. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the practice of using hulk ships began to face criticism. Reformers pointed out the obvious: overcrowding, disease, decay, monotony. Some argued that it was inhumane, though others shrugged and said it was effective. And indeed, hulks worked in their own way. They contained prisoners when land-based prisons couldn't. They kept them out of sight. They were cheap, relatively easy to maintain, and quietly terrifying. But as penal reform progressed, hulks gradually became obsolete. New prisons were built with better ventilation, more space, and eventually a slightly higher standard of humanity. Still, for over a century, hulks remained a fixture. They were not glamorous, they were not heroic, and they were certainly not pleasant, but they were real. And the stories of those who lived aboard them, the boredom, the small joys, the persistent struggle to survive, remained fascinating in a quiet, somber way. Floating, rotting prisons, slowly decaying in the river, holding hundreds, sometimes thousands of lives, day after day. A kind of sad poetry, really. So, as we continue drifting through the history of hulks, next time we'll meet some of the most unusual prisoners, the oddest incidents, and perhaps explore the occasional heroic or at least memorable moments that occurred amidst the monotony. Because even in a place designed for slow despair, humans still found ways to surprise, annoy, and endure.
let's float deeper into the peculiar world of hulks. We've covered the general life, the monotony, the smells, and even the small comforts people scraped together. But now it's time for the stories that make you quietly shake your head and wonder why humans do the things they do, or how the universe keeps letting them survive in such absurd conditions. One of the most famous cases involves a prisoner named William Williams. Now, Williams wasn't necessarily the cleverest man alive, but he was persistent. He somehow managed to escape from 3 different land prisons before ending up on a hulk. Once aboard, he tried to dig his way out using a spoon. Not a pickaxe, not a crowbar, a spoon. Somehow he managed to tunnel a few inches into the wooden hold before being discovered. When confronted by a guard, he reportedly shrugged and said, "Well, I thought I'd try." No one knows what he expected to happen after a few inches, but the quiet absurdity of that moment stuck in the records. And in the slow-moving life of a hulk, that tiny bit of rebellion, even failed, was a story people whispered about for years. Then there's the case of Sarah Copley, a woman imprisoned for petty theft. Sarah had a particular knack for mischief and found a very unusual way to amuse herself while on the hulk. She taught the rats to steal food. Not just from her, mind you. She was clever enough to feed them scraps in secret so they would distract other prisoners' meals. Eventually, this became something of a legend among the women on board. Guards noticed nothing at first, until one morning everyone complained about missing rations, and Sarah was quietly giggling in her corner. It's a small, absurd victory in a place designed to crush the spirit, and perhaps it was the closest anyone ever came to a fun moment aboard a hulk. Let's float over to another tragicomic tale. There was a man named Thomas Yates, known for being the unluckiest prisoner alive. He somehow survived multiple shipwrecks before ending up on a hulk, ironically a stationary vessel meant to contain him. Once there, he developed an allergy to the mold that covered the decks. For weeks he sneezed constantly, a sort of private punishment no one else quite noticed, except the guards who rolled their eyes and handed him a piece of bread.
Thomas eventually died of unrelated causes years later, but the image of him sneezing continuously in a slowly rotting prison is quietly hilarious if you squint at it through historical distance. Hulks were also home to some rather unusual celebrities of crime. Take, for instance, a man named Henry Longfingers Thompson. He had gained a certain notoriety for being able to pickpocket anyone, anywhere, at almost any speed. Once on the hulk, he found that his skills were, well, mostly useless. With everyone crammed together, guards watching constantly, and food already rationed carefully, there weren't many opportunities for thievery. Eventually, he turned his skills toward small crafts, carving intricate wooden figurines from scraps of deck timber. The figurines were later sold to visiting officials as Hulk art. And in a strange twist of irony, Henry became famous not for crime, but for art created in the slowest, dullest environment imaginable. Disease, as we've mentioned, was always present, but it sometimes played out in almost absurd patterns. On one hulk, there was a smallpox outbreak that caused some prisoners to hide in the upper decks, trying to avoid the infected lower holds. The irony, of course, was that hiding on a decaying ship with rats and mold everywhere didn't make them much safer. But the human mind likes to feel in control, even when the universe is just slowly rotting around it. Then there were the accidental heroes. One of them was a woman named Elizabeth Harris, who discovered a small leak in the hull of her hulk. Most prisoners ignored it, assuming it would be someone else's problem. But Elizabeth started bailing water quietly every day, slowing the decay in that section of the ship. Guards eventually noticed and praised her efforts, giving her slightly better rations. It's an almost absurdly mundane heroism,
stop your floating prison from sinking a little and earn a biscuit. Yet, in a place designed for despair, small acts like this became monumental in memory. Some hulks had infamous reputations not for disease or monotony, but for the odd personalities that emerged. One particular hulk, moored near Portsmouth, was nicknamed the Floating Circus. This wasn't because of entertainment or fun, but because of the personalities that flourished or clashed in its confined space. There was one prisoner who claimed he was a former nobleman in disguise, another who pretended to speak fluent French but actually just made noises, and a group of women who staged mock courts to judge trivial offenses like stealing a biscuit or hogging a patch of sunlight. Guards reportedly found the mock courts mildly amusing, or perhaps they just tolerated them, enjoying the mental chaos from a safe distance. And of course, rumors flourished. Stories about haunted hulks, ghosts of former prisoners, and mysterious disappearances circulated quietly. No one really confirmed them, because, let's face it, on a hulk, a missing person could just be hiding in a corner or lying sick in the lower hold. But the whispers added texture to the slow days in life. And in the quiet monotony of hulk life, even a small rumor could spark hours of discussion, planning, or daydreaming, which was almost like traveling for someone who could never leave. Occasionally, hulks also intersected with larger historical events. During times of war, captured sailors, privateers, or political prisoners were sometimes confined to hulks. These people who had faced storms, gunfire, and naval battles ended up in a situation that was somehow simultaneously safer and more frustrating. A ship that didn't move, where the battles were internal, slow, and psychological. Some found the monotony worse than combat and quietly admitted in letters or diaries that they'd almost prefer cannon fire over rotting wood and rationed bread. Interestingly, the presence of children aboard hulks created bizarre scenes. Children born on hulks grew up entirely within the smell of mold and rats, learning to walk on uneven planks, hearing stories of minor rebellions and petty theft before they could fully understand what a normal childhood might look like. One account mentions a small boy running around the upper deck, laughing at the funny smells and dodging the occasional rat. The adults tolerated it, partly because it gave a sense of life aboard a place designed for slow decay. The juxtaposition of innocence and monotony created a strange, almost surreal feeling in the daily rhythm of hulk life. By the mid-19th century, reform movements began documenting all of these oddities and tragedies, often with a dry, wry tone. Inspectors noted overcrowding, disease, vermin, boredom, and strange human resilience. They also recorded humor, prisoners telling jokes, carving trinkets, playing mock games, and inventing nicknames for everything. These reports, often read aloud by reform-minded officials, must have sounded both tragic and absurd, a human comedy performed on damp wooden stages floating in stagnant waters. In the end, hulks weren't glamorous. They weren't heroic. They weren't meant to be. They were simply a solution to a problem. What do we do with too many people and not enough prisons? And the human spirit found ways to endure, sometimes bizarrely, sometimes tragically, sometimes absurdly. A man carving wooden ships while sneezing, a woman teaching rats to steal, children born with the smell of mildew as their first memory. And through it all, the hulks quietly decayed, silently holding the stories of everyone who ever called them home. So, as we continue this slow drift, next time we'll look even further into the decline of hulks, their eventual disappearance, and the legacy they left behind in maritime history, penal reform, and quiet human endurance. Because if there's one thing we can take from these floating prisons, it's that humans are endlessly inventive at surviving boredom, misery, and rot, sometimes at the same time.
By now, you've floated with us through the slow, damp corridors of hulks, witnessed the oddities, the little rebellions, and the quiet tragedies of people trapped on these floating prisons. Tonight, as we reach the final stretch of our journey, let's drift into what ultimately happened to the Hulks and how their story quietly lingers in history. By the mid-19th century, reformers, social critics, and even some sympathetic politicians had finally had enough of Hulks. And it wasn't hard to see why. The combination of disease, overcrowding, monotony, and decaying wood made them objectively terrible places. Reports were written with a mixture of concern and dry humor, noting everything from the abominable stench to the curious perseverance of rats and men alike. Slowly, a consensus formed. Hulks were, at best, a temporary stopgap, and at worst, a cruel, unnecessary experiment in monotony. New prisons on land began to replace them, designed with more space, better ventilation, and, importantly, slightly less decay. Modern plumbing was still a dream, but at least prisoners weren't constantly sharing a home with vermin who had little respect for personal boundaries. Transportation to colonies also became more organized. Hulks, once essential, were increasingly obsolete. Some were sold, some broken up for timber, and some were simply left to rot a little longer before fading entirely from the docks. Interestingly, their legacy didn't disappear completely. Maritime culture, literature, and even the occasional artwork immortalized them. Artists loved the image of hulks as ghostly, decaying hulls floating in misty harbors. Writers referred to them as symbols of human endurance, quiet suffering, and bureaucratic absurdity. In a way, hulks became part of the cultural imagination. Not glamorous, not heroic, not fun, but deeply, hauntingly human. Hulks also left a quieter legacy in penal reform. Their failures became examples of what not to do. Overcrowding, poor hygiene, lack of meaningful work, and extreme monotony were lessons that shaped later approaches to incarceration. And, ironically, despite their flaws, hulks taught a subtle truth about humanity. Even in environments designed to crush the spirit, people found ways to endure, amuse themselves, care for one another, and sometimes just survive day by day. As we drift to the very end of this story, it's worth remembering the tiny, quiet victories aboard these ships. The carved wooden trinkets, the whispered jokes, the small acts of kindness. Even something as simple as surviving a day on a rotten old boat counts. In the slow, unexciting rhythm of life aboard a hulk, these small moments of agency and resilience were monumental. And in thinking about them, there's a strange kind of peace. Because if they could endure so slowly, surely we can endure the tiny discomforts of our own day. So, as you lay there, maybe your eyelids getting heavier, I'll leave you with the image of a hulk ship at sunset. The rivers calm, the wooden deck weathered, and the smell of the world's slow decay lingers faintly in the air. Somewhere in the hold, a carved wooden boat drifts in a puddle. A small act of creativity, a quiet rebellion against monotony. And just like that, everything is still. The rats have settled, the prisoners are sleeping, and the world moves quietly onward. And so, friends, we close the chapter on hulks. No dramatic fireworks, no heroic battles, just quiet, slow, enduring human life aboard floating prisons. May it remind you that even in slow, monotonous places, there is endurance, resilience, and the occasional absurdity. Good night. Sleep well. Let your thoughts drift gently like a tiny boat on a calm river, and may tomorrow feel a little less like a hulk and a little more like the open sea.